Okay, Doris, could you introduce yourself, please?
Well, my name's Doris Kershaw. I was Doris Townsend, and I was born in Chandler Street in Hereford, and when my father died, moved to St Nicholas Street in Hereford. I went to Lord Scudamore School, and I left at 14, and worked then at Vivian's until I was married.
Gorgeous. I wonder if you can tell me, Doris, if you could tell me how you got your job at Vivian's and what you did there.
Well, it was very interesting because when I left at Scudamore School, we were divided in our sixth form into third year English and commercial or third year practical. If you wanted to be a nurse or something in that line, well, then you went into third year practical. You went into third year English and commercial if you wanted an office job, and you learned Pitman shorthand and typing in the final year. And I had visions that I would be going to the post office because there weren't very many jobs. There was the post office and there was Bournemouth Cider Works, and I think it was Painters Brothers. And I decided I'd go into the post office. Well, I went for interview and I had to do a very small exam about geography, which I passed. And at the very last moment, they asked me if I would take down a message that was coming from another room by telephone. And I picked up the telephone with my right hand because I am left-handed. And the man's face fell and said, "I'm very sorry, we don't employ anybody who's left-handed." And I was so upset. And he said, well, we couldn't even employ the King of England, which was, of course, then George VI, because he's left-handed, which he thought comforted me. Anyway, it all turned out very well, because my mother worked at Vivian of Hereford with Miss Durrant when she was young. And Miss Durrant said, well, if Doris would like to come and work here, she can work here. And I went, well, I was a real dog's body, making tea and going to the bank and general things. But I did accompany Miss Durrant when she went out photographing, but all I did was carry the slides. And it was a 1210 plate camera, and so I used to have to hand her the slides and put them in a darkened case as she took the photographs. One very funny occasion I remember, we were photographing the Dean and Chapter at Hereford Cathedral. And as I lived in St Nicholas Street, Miss Durrant said, "I'll meet you in the close. There's no need to come to the studio." And my mother said, well, if it's the Dean and Chapter, perhaps you better put on your Sunday clothes. And so I thought I looked the dog's body and went over to the close, and Miss Durrant was horrified because I hadn't a hat. And so I had to run all the way back home and get a hat because I wasn't dressed properly to photograph the Dean and Chapter.
So it would be really interesting, Doris, if you could tell me a bit more about the studio. Who worked there? Who was Miss Durrant?
Yes.
Were there any men there?
No men at all. And of course I've realised since we've heard all this about the Great War that there were very many men around. No, there was Miss Ada Durrant, who was the photographer, and then there was Miss Gertrude Durrant, and she was her sister. They lived in St James Road, and Miss Gertrude Durrant did all the finances, wages, everything. Miss Ada Durrant, of course, was the photographer. And one didn't realise then what a wonderful photographer she was. The photographs were amazing, and she was a perfectionist. I've seen Miss Durrant tear up dozens of photographs in front of you when she didn't think they were printed well enough. And she always signed every photograph, and every photograph, you know, was scrutinised to make sure it was quite perfect before it went out to the customer. No men worked with us at the studio. There was Mrs. Brewer, who was the colourist. There was Isabel Parry, who was the finisher. And Miss Forsyth was also a friend of Miss Durrant's. And a lot of people, a lot of women worked there. The only man that ever worked at Vivian's is when they opened the polyphoto branch, which was in St Peter's Street opposite St Peter's Church, and Patrick Seymour did all the framing. And that was the only man who worked at Vivian's all the time I was there. The photographs were of the troops, because of course we photographed Bradbury Lines and we photographed Credon Hill, and all those photographs were troops, and they were photographed regularly, and they were mounted and printed at a printer's in Bill Street. But as I say, we had no contact with men at all, except the taxi driver, Mr. Weaver, his name was, because of petrol rationing. And Miss Durrant did have a car, but I suppose with petrol rationing she wasn't allowed to use it very much. And we used to have Mr. Weaver from Marriott's garage, who used to take us everywhere. No signposts, so it was always a mystery as which way we went.
And why was it just women working there? I wonder if you could paint that picture for us.
Well, I think the reason it was only women was because of the war, the Great War, and the men had all been sadly killed or injured, and their marriages were quite different. And I think Miss Durrant was the sort of person who had a lot of friends, and probably a lot of her friends worked at the studio. We didn't have very many young people. They all seemed to be sort of middle-aged ladies. But perhaps that's because I was young and I felt they were elderly. I don't know.
I wonder if some of the ladies who worked there, were they all misses as well?
Oh, no, they were all Miss. It was Mrs. Brewer, but Miss Forsyth, yes, Miss White used to come. No, a lot of Miss Brown. Now, she was a printer, and she was a very good printer, and I think she was the head of the printing department.
You mentioned a Miss White. Was that Miss White of Morderford?
Yes, it was. Yes.
Could you tell us a bit about her?
Miss White was a friend of Miss Durrant, and she used to come in occasionally and do a bit of work, but I think she was more a friend. I do remember she was very artistic, and I can't quite remember who she lived with, but they were two very lovely ladies, and I've still got a handkerchief that Miss White gave me on my wedding day, and my granddaughter used it on, well, I don't say she used it, but she certainly took it with her wedding dress last year in London. And Miss White gave me that handkerchief when I left the studio. But I think Miss White probably was more a friend of Miss Durrant's. Miss Marsh, I think it was, she lived with. It's just sort of come to me. I think it was Miss Marsh.
Gorgeous. That's so interesting. That's so interesting. So at the time, I wonder if you could tell us, Doris, what sort of decade we're talking about. Was it, and also the competition in the city at the time. What other photographers were working at that time?
Yes, I can tell you that Bustin was a very good photographer. He had a studio at facing the cathedral at the top of King Street. Mr. Bustin took very, very good photographs, and I think if there was any opposition, it was from Mr. Bustin, because he was an excellent photographer. There was Hammond in King Street, and I'm just trying to think of the name of the people in Church Street. Rumsey's. There was Rumsey's in Church Street. And they were all very, very good photographers. But of course, people didn't have mobiles, and they had to go to studios to be photographed, other than the box brownie and the very early cameras. So we were always busy.
I'd be really interested to hear how the studio was viewed by. It would be very unusual for its time to have a studio like that with a woman owner and boss and a female team. I wonder how it was viewed by people.
I think it was always considered the photographer in Hereford. And I think people from outlying villages all came to Hereford to be photographed by Vivian of Hereford. And very famous people were photographed by Miss Durrant, Sir Edward Elgar, Vaughan Williams, especially at Three Choirs Festival times. Very famous people, and they all were photographed by Miss Durrant. In fact, in the Elgar Museum near Worcester, where I live now, there's the photograph Miss Durrant took of Sir Edward Elgar on the steps of Hereford Cathedral, signed by him. But that photograph was always in the waiting room at Vivian of Hereford, and I noticed when I went to the Elgar Museum, it must be a copy that's in the Elgar Museum now, because the signature isn't on it. So I think they must have sold the original.
Were you ever there? Were you far too young to have been there for those photographs?
Oh no, I wasn't there when Elgar was photographed, although I did meet Elgar. I met Elgar. My grandfather was a musician, and he was organist of St. Peter's Church in Hereford, and he was very, very friendly with Sir Percy Hull. And, well, he wasn't Sir Percy Hull then, he was Percy Hull, of course. But my grandfather used to tune pianos, and I used to meet him in the Cathedral Close often. I think he went for a quick drink at the Conservative Club on his way home often. And I used to meet him in the Cathedral Close. And this particular day, I saw him talking to three people in the close, and as a child you didn't interfere, you stood back, and I stood back, and my grandfather said, I want you just to say hello to these three people. And I shook hands with Sir Percy Hull, whom I did know roughly from sort of meeting him with my grandfather, and the other person was Edward Elgar, and the other person was George Bernard Shaw. And they were attending, of course, the Three Choirs Festival. And that was the last time, I think, that Elgar went to. So I would be about 9, would I? Something like that, anyway.
So you said your mother worked there?
Yes, my mother worked with Miss Durrant when she was young. And my mother, it was Jakeman and Carver, I believe, then. And I don't know, in Hereford, you went up up steps to the studio, and there was the Cadena Cafe. And then there was Russell's next door, which was a stationer's and bookseller. And I think it was Jakeman and Carver that she was the name of the shop that she worked with Miss Durrant before as a young person. And my mother was a retoucher and finisher. So you retouched the negatives and you got all the wrinkles out and things. be very handy now for me. and uh, and she did. She was the retoucher and finisher. And Miss Durrant, when my mother sort of got older, Miss Durrant asked her if she'd go back and work for her, which she did. And she worked for her until, well, about a couple of years before she died, because she worked there after I left Vivian's.
Gosh, that's amazing.
And of course, I was sort of the photographer for Polyphoto. I don't know whether you know anything about Polyphoto, but it was a studio opposite St Peter's Church. And 48 positions for £0.50, 2 and 6pence. And they used to queue on a Saturday to be photographed, especially RAF and Bradbury Line soldiers and airmen. And I used to take all those. And I took babies. I loved taking babies, because with 48 positions, you could just roll the camera on. And I used to love doing that.
Who taught you?
Nobody. It was a machine that was very easy to use. You more or less turned a handle. You focused it and you turned a handle. It was a very heavy machine, actually. And then all the slides were sent to Stanmore in Middlesex to be developed and printed. And they were glass slides, and so often got broken because it was, well, sort of during the end of the war. Yes, I do remember the colour process, because Miss Durrant was very, very proud of it, where you put the 3 colours into one. And the first print she did was of St George's Chapel, Windsor, which of course is a very beautiful photograph. And she did another one, which I have tried to trace, but I haven't heard anything. And it was something for the Women's Institute, I think, which was a carpet or something like that. But that was one of the other colour photographs that I remember she did from this process. But I wasn't anything to do with the developing and printing, so I haven't much knowledge about it, really. But I do remember seeing the photographs, of course.
What was she like?
Miss Durrant?
Yes.
Scatty, but lovely. complete. Miss G. Durrant was the grounded one. Miss A. Durrant was, well, we always called her Miss A Durrant. She was lovely, but completely scatty. I remember her leaving a Leica camera in a cornfield, and she had this horrible dog called Timmy Bubba. She took everywhere with her, and she called it Timmy Bubba, which was very embarrassing. And I remember my husband was in the Royal Engineers at Malvern, and she went out to take his troop. He was a second lieutenant, and so he said, oh, I suppose I must ask Miss Durrant, because he knew Miss Durrant, because of course he came to collect me from work many, many times, and Miss Durrant came quite friendly with him. And I remember we took this photograph of his troop in Malvern, at RRE Malvern, and my husband said, oh, I better ask her into the officers' mess for a cup of coffee. And so he invited Miss Durrant over, and as she went in, all the men stood up. She had this horrible dog. and all the men stood up, and she said, sit down, my men. I know Mr. Kershaw very well. And of course, he was so embarrassed. I think it was the most dreadful moment of his life, I should imagine. But no, she was a lovely, lovely person. She was very religious, and she attended All Saints Church in Hereford, and she played the violin. I remember going to a concert where she was playing a violin in St Peter's Church. No, she was a lovely, lovely person, and she looked after her staff very, very well. But she had this artistic temperament, I suppose, really. Well, you see, it was the end of the war, because when I was at school, we were blacking out the windows with tape and things, you know, putting tape on the windows in case they shattered. So it was the very end of the war. Well, I was born in 1926, so, and I was 14 when I went there, 26, 36. About 1940, wasn't it? I was there 1940.
That's great. That's brilliant.
1940 until I was married at 25.
You were there for a long time.
Yes.
Are there any moments, Doris, during that 10 years that stand out for you, that are highlights for you?
Do you mean
At
as
Vivian?
regards at Vivian's?
Yeah, working.
Well, the only thing really were the important people, and I used to go with Miss Durrant then, of course, to photograph very famous families, and you know, Lettice Cotterill. I'm trying to think of. We went to a lovely wedding at Belmont Abbey of people that lived there. I think the thing was that during the war, you see, we were all just helping one another, weren't we? I would say, you know, we worked very hard and very late. If photographs had to be finished, well, we stayed until they were finished. There was no question of overtime or anything like that. We just sort of worked on. I was in St. Peter's Choir, you see, during that time, so I loved that, and my sort of life was surrounded by music.
What I'm curious about, Doris, is that Miss Durrant did all the photographs of the troops. I'm curious that this is a woman doing that particular role. Do you know how she came to get that contract?
I think simply because she was the best photographer in Hereford. But you mean the ones of the troops at Cretan Hill and at Bradbury Lines and
Yes.
things, and then Malvern, of course, because she came over to RRE Malvern. No, she was so well known, you know.
During your working career with Miss Durrant,
Yes.
did you ever come across Derek Evans?
I'm sorry, I missed that.
During your time at Vivian Studio,
Yes.
did you ever know Derek Evans?
Well, I heard of him, but I didn't know him personally. No, I didn't know him, but I had heard of him, of course, because, well, he was one of the leading photographers as well, wasn't he? Was he in Commercial Road? Somewhere there?
Broad Street. He was Broad Street.
Broad
and
Street.
Latterly, Edgar Street.
Ah, no, well, I didn't really know very much about him.
Also,
What period would he have?
well, I would say late 50s he probably got started.
Well, you see, I was married in 51 and left to go to Bradford in Yorkshire. So I probably didn't know him very well.
Bit after your time.
I expect you've got some recollection of Pauline Seymour.
I think Keith has.
Because Pauline was Miss Durrant's right hand as regards going out and photographing, because she drove. And she drove Miss Durrant.
No.
Yeah. Miss Durrant took, of course, my wedding photographs to my lovely husband Cyril, and and we had the group. I rather hoped that Miss Durrant would have been on that photograph, but of course she was taking it, but Miss G. Durrant is on the photograph. And they both came to our wedding reception at the Castle Pool Hotel and the wedding at St. Peter's Church, where I was in the choir. So we had the full choir, and my roses came from the Wyvale nurses. Mr. Williamson gave them to me, because Wyvale then was a very, very small company. And John James, who worked for Mr. Williamson, was in our choir. He was in the RAF and sang in the choir, and his wife, Jean Haunt, her name was also in the choir. We were robed, and all our robes required 10 clothing coupons each, which the congregation provided. Yes, I enjoyed working at Vivian so much, and that is of course why I stayed so long. Miss Durrant was a wonderful boss and always very considerate. But she was a perfectionist. Everything had to be done absolutely as Miss Durrant required. But I loved my life there. I loved going out and photographing families. I loved my time at the polyphoto when I was taking polyphotos. And of course it was a gift shop as well as a photographer's. And so we sold art prints and pottery. And I think I gained an awful lot from working at Vivian's. I just loved it. And having not had a higher school education, I felt I learned so much between the time I left school and when I left home. Well, I was very fortunate in a way to be brought up with my grandparents because my father died when I was 5 years old, and we went to live with my grandparents, who had been members of the rowing club for 50 years, and we spent our lives really on the River Wye. We just loved it, and when old enough, learned to row. We were quite young, and we used to row as far as Belmont and Brainton. That was as far as we rowed. Had lovely picnics, and well, rowed most days after school. And I was very friendly with a girl called Barbara Jordan, and Barbara Jordan's family owned Jordan's boathouse on the other side of the river, but Hereford Rowing Club really, it was a bit in for a dig to go up on the other side of the river. That was Jordan's side, and Hereford Rowing Club, well, we all know Mr. Carousel was the boatman, and he used to, we always hired the large, well, hired is the wrong word probably, but we always went up in 2 large boats because we were a large family. And then we used to row as far as Brainton, Belmont, and take our picnics and light fires, which I suppose we wouldn't be allowed to do these days. And we had the most fantastic time. I just loved the river. I didn't see the sea until I was 9 years old, and we went on a choir outing to Weston-super-Mare, and the tide was out, and I thought, oh, if this is the sea, I'd rather have the River Wye. But still, it was lovely. I spent most days after school on the river. My grandparents used to use the river so much. They used to go after work, and then I used to go and meet them after work, and we had a lovely, lovely time. But I think the highlight was when my cousins came down from Bradford in Yorkshire, and they used to come down by train. Now, before they came, their clothes arrived in a great trunk, and it was delivered by GWR horse and cart. We were always so excited when that horse and cart arrived at our house with their trunk, with all their clothes for a fortnight. We spent every minute of the day on the river. And although they've travelled the world now, they still say it was the best time of their lives. They just loved the River Wye. And oh, we had such fun. We had such fun. We lit campfires, and I remember August, they always came the August bank holiday fortnight. And so you can imagine the food, because we would be my grandparents, my mum, my two brothers, their family of four, their son's family of four, and we all met up the river, and we had these wonderful, wonderful picnics. And I remember August bank holiday weekend, you can imagine the catering. And Burton's Bakery used to be in, I've forgotten quite, it was up Berrington Street, and then you turned right, and they cooked bread. And we used to go there and buy 17 loaves that lasted us for the weekend. And they were all hot, and we used to have all those loaves, and we used to take this massive picnic up the river, as you can imagine. And I can see now, my grandfather used to carve the ham. My grandmother used to cut the bread, and there was my mother and my aunts, and they all had the salads and everything else, and a long line, and we all used to have this wonderful, wonderful picnic. They were such happy, happy days. Then we used to swim in the river, of course, and I mean, we did know the river where we swam very, very well, and we all learned to swim in the river. My grandfather used to always tell us to walk up and swim down, and then we knew that we were always in our depth. And we always did that. I can see where we moored the boat. I remember one night we had a tremendous thunderstorm. I think it's a well-known thunderstorm because it hit the water tower in Hereford, and opposite there was a family, it was called Wall's Farm, I believe, and the boat was filling with water. The storm was so heavy, and we had my grandfather with us, I think, and he said, no, it's not safe, we'll moor the boat. And we moored the boat at Wall's Farm, and I can remember it was as black as night, and we sort of scrambled up the bank through the nettles, and these people, who I don't know their name, but they obviously it was Wall's Farm, whether their name was Walls I don't know, but they dried us all out and took us home in cars, which of course was very, very, we didn't have a car, so it was all very, very exciting. And in the meantime, my mother and my aunt were so worried about us being on the river in this tremendous storm that they'd started walking up the path, the river path, to see if they could find us, and they saw the boat moored, and they knew that we were all safe.
My goodness, what a fantastic picture you paint. Oh my God, Doris.
No, it was, I can remember that very, very well indeed, very well. But that was our only experience of a very, very bad thunderstorm. And I believe it killed a horse in the field by the water tower. But it was a very serious storm. But you could see the water filling the boat. The rain was so heavy.
So your swimming costumes, were they woolen?
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, I had a swimming costume made out of a cardigan, because it was wartime. And they were horrible because they used to sag. You can imagine, can't you? Once you'd had a swim, they were sort of all drooping. No, we all had swimming costumes. And we all wore white because we belonged to the rowing club. White and grey. Yes. And the Hammonds, the Hammond photographers, they were brilliant oarsmen. And I remember when my cousins came down from Bradford, we used to say, oh, those are the Hammonds, we'll race them back down to the rowing club, which we always tried to do.
I've heard so many funny stories about the indignity of the woolen swimming costume.
Oh, yes, they were terrible.
When we came in, you were talking that the river gives great pleasure, but also you were talking about the tragic event of the evacuees.
Oh, yes, that was dreadful, terrible. It was, of course, very cold. The river was iced over. I can't quite remember exactly where it was, but I know it was sort of the river that flows past the art school was the art school in Hereford, and these boys from Birmingham, I think it was King Edward's Grammar School, I have a feeling it was called King Edward's anyway, and sadly went through the ice, and they couldn't come up, of course the river flowing underneath it, and I've forgotten how many of them drowned. And I remember walking up the river bank the following day, and there was this one cap, and it was full of ice. It was just iced, and it belonged to one of the boys that had unfortunately been drowned. But we were so sad about that. It was dreadful, dreadful.
Terrible, terrible event, it really was.
And yes, it was. Well, the two things, of course, the other was the Garrick fire, but that was long before my time. But my grandparents were very aware and told me all about that.
Did you say you went to the art college at the Pavilion?
It was on the Cattle Green. Actually, on the Cattle Green was the art college.
Did you ever play in the river when you were at the college?
No. It was very deep, you know, was the river. It was shallow, sort of. I used to paddle, I suppose, when I was young, by the Victoria Bridge, because that had a sort of beach, hadn't it, of pebbles. And I used to paddle there, but the water was really deep underneath the art school there. So I don't think I ever went in there at all. My grandfather was particularly, careful about where we did swim or paddle, because the current is quite strong. Of course, I went to the art school. I also lived so near the river that we walked most days probably through the Castle Green, over the Victoria Bridge, and then back the other way and over the Wye Bridge. And oh yes, people used to dive over the Victoria Bridge, which really was very, very dangerous because there were shallow bits, but there was also the current of the streams. And it was very unwise, but people did do that. And also, I remember between the rowing club and Brainton, there used to be some quite large trees, Hunderton it was called, and they had ropes tied to these trees, and they used to swing across the river on these ropes and drop from the ropes. And really that was quite dangerous, I suppose, in a way, but it was just considered fun. But I'm afraid I was a coward. I didn't do any of that. No.
Very sensible, I would say.
I think,
sensible.
No, I didn't do any of that. But I mean, we just loved the river. We used to make campfires and I know when we used to go to Brainton, we used to walk up to the church, and the field going up to the church was always full of mushrooms. We used to get up very early in the morning and gather mushrooms and carrier bags full, not just a few mushrooms. I think we got there before the farmer, and then we'd have a dip in the river and come home for breakfast.
Oh my goodness!
Sounds lovely,
It's so
doesn't it?
idyllic.
Mm.
It's so idyllic.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Well, it was my brother and myself that used to do that, and we shared a bicycle. I didn't have a bicycle, so I used to go on his bar, and we used to cycle up to get the mushrooms, have a dip in the river, and go home.
I'd love to ask you about the Mayfair. Did you ever go to the Mayfair?
Oh yes, that was the occasion of the year, was the Mayfair, because we had our first ice cream of the year at the Mayfair, and we used to go to Roger's Cafe, and we used to have a little sort of bowl that was a little metal bowl, and the wafers stuck in the ice cream. Oh, it was such a treat. That was the Mayfair. And then when we lived in St Nicholas Street, the Wall of Death was the in front of our bedroom window, and we had window seats in our bedrooms, and we used to hide behind the curtains and listen to the terrible roar of these motorbikes going round and round and round this wall of death. And then there were, of course, roundabouts and stalls all up to the cathedral, along Broad Street, and in the High Town. And then in the High Town, there was some tradition, and I've forgotten what it was, a sack of grain or a sack of something that was exchanged at the beginning of the fair. And then the carousel of the horses, I can't think what it was called. We used to call it the big horses. I can't remember what it was called, but the horses that moved up and down on this carousel was always in the same place, just in front of the old house.
What about some of the stalls, the dancing girls, the bearded lady?
Oh yes, oh they were horrid. The fattest lady, the biggest lady, or the bearded lady. I wasn't allowed to go into those. But they used to stand outside sometimes and, you know, sort of encourage people in to all these stalls. There were, of course, the children's roundabouts that were very sweet. Coconut shies. We always had a coconut. You always had to unroll a penny. But we used to save up for the Mayfair. We used to save our pocket money for the Mayfair. And I remember my brother's godfather was Augustus Edwards, the Furriers of the West, that had the concave windows in his shop in High Town. And I don't know whether you remember those, but they were concave windows in his shop, Augustus Edwards. And he used to give my brother's pocket money because he was his godchild for the Mayfair. So my brother always had more money than me, which was a bit of a pain.
Augustus Edwards, that's quite a name, isn't it?
Well, he was called the Furrier of the West, wasn't he? Because he sold fur coats and things, didn't he?
Goodness me,
Oh.
right, yeah.
I remember one of the lovely carousels was situated always in front of the old house, and that was the first roundabout that was put up every Mayfair. That was the first roundabout that was assembled.
Yeah, so I guess I'm just asking you about that lovely thing you said earlier about what an amazing era it was to grow up in and have experienced.
Yes, I feel that we've all been very privileged to live in the era that we are living in, with so many changes. I was 5 when my father died, I think as results of the First World War. And my brother was 6, my younger brother was 2, and my father was a jeweller and cutler in Hereford, called Townsend's, and we had to live with my grandparents because he was only 40 when he died, and of course it was hard for my mother. But I feel so privileged, really, in a way, that I live with my grandparents, because my grandfather was a musician, which brought me into the musical world, and I loved my choir, which was St. Peter's Choir in Hereford, and he was the organist and a choir master there. And my experience at Vivian's, I was so pleased I was rejected from the post office, because it gave me such a wonderful opportunity to meet people that I would have never met in an ordinary sort of job. And I feel so privileged that I've lived in an age with so many changes. I think it's been wonderful. And I've loved young people of this generation. I think they are so maligned in many ways, but all the young people that I've come in contact with, I feel are such wonderful young people that have wonderful careers and are so interesting. At the back of the house where I live is a school, and it is only a primary school. But I am so interested in all the things that they do now that we, were unable to do because of all the technology that there is these days. But yes, I feel very, very pleased that I have lived in this particular era.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you, Doris. And do you think it's also got anything to do with living in Herefordshire in that age?
Oh yes, I still think the Wye is still the loveliest river. It's much nicer than the Severn, although I live in Worcester. But the Severn was a trading river, whereas the Wye is so, so beautiful. I think the Wye is such a beautiful river from Plinlimmon to wherever, you know. I think it's really lovely, lovely. Well, my childhood was so, so happy, and it was made by the river, I'm sure.
Oh, that's gorgeous.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering if I could ask you a little bit about what Herefordshire was like when you were working at Vivian's, or what Hereford town was like, if it's changed a lot.
Yes, well, of course, I haven't seen it very recently. I haven't seen Hereford very recently, but oh, the High Town was such a busy, busy place, of course. When I worked at Vivian's, we were next door to the market hall. Well, every Wednesday and every Saturday, all the market people from outlying villages came in with their large baskets of eggs and butter, flowers, plants. And the market hall was a very, very busy place. There were butchers and fishmongers, sweet stalls. It was a hive of industry, and people used to come to Hereford, of course, from outlying villages, because it was where they could get things like their furniture and everything else. They used to just come into Hereford on yeomen's buses, and there was it was a busy, busy place. I remember the market hall particularly, and then of course there was the cattle market, and all the farmers brought in their animals, and they were auctioned off and sold, and We always went to I think it was a Wednesday was market day, and when we were small children, we were always taken to the market to see the animals on a Wednesday. No, it was a very exciting place to be.
Great. I guess there's just one more thing to ask, which is something we kind of ask everyone about the nature of this project and what you think the worth is of us collecting stories like this. If you think there is a good reason to collect stories like yours and other people's.
I think there's a very good reason for archives these days. I think I would never have believed that you would have come and asked me these questions and that I would have had photographs that would interest you. But of course, with digital cameras and mobiles, people take hundreds and hundreds of photographs on mobiles. My grandchildren do, and no one's going to see them again probably, whereas all these archives are our history. And I'm sure that in years to come they'll always be there and that people will be interested in them.